Hello everyone, good evening. I hope you're doing well, and I wanted to thank everyone for joining today's webinar on Ecocide despite the current circumstances. I'll start by briefly introducing myself. So my name is Chloe Mikolajczak and I'm a youth, climate and social justice activist based here in Brussels. And to be 100% honest with you, in the past few days, I have felt very hopeless and helpless. Between the war in Ukraine and the latest IPCC report that was just released yesterday, reminding us about our window of opportunity to tackle climate breakdown, reduce our emissions, adapt, and essentially have a shot at saving ourselves, it's been very difficult to feel positive and keep envisioning what the future will look like for my generation. But then I was reminded of something very special and very important via something a friend posted on social media, and I'm going to read it to you. It can be very overwhelming to witness, experience, take in all the injustices of the moment. The good news is they're all connected. So if your little corner of work involves pulling at one of the threads, you're helping to unravel the whole damn cloth. And it just reminded that everything we do, every step we take, every policy or commitment we manage to secure is a step in the right direction. And you know what they say, the cure to hopelessness is action. And this is why we are here tonight, to discuss and hear from experts on one of the most powerful tools that is available to us to halt the destruction of nature and hold the responsible accountable, Ecocide. Ecocide could be a game changer, a radical new framework through which the destruction of environment would not be socially acceptable anymore and actually become criminal. A tool to address the environmental and climate crisis, of course, but also social justice, because we know how interlinked the two are. And we also know how often the abuse of nature goes hand in hand with the abuse of people, and more specifically, marginalized communities. So this is why I am incredibly excited for this evening and the panelists that we'll be hearing from tonight. But before we get started, I just wanted to share a few technical information. I see that some people are already starting to introduce themselves in the chat. That's lovely. I strongly encourage you to do that. It's great to see so many people coming from all around. If you have any technical issues, please share them in the chat. And if you want to ask questions, which I strongly encourage you to do, please use the Q&A feature, which should be at the bottom of your screen. How this webinar will take place. Each panelist will have about 15 minutes. And unfortunately, I have to share that we are a panelist down. Olivier De Schutter won't be with us tonight because unfortunately he had an accident. He is okay, I reassure you, but he won't be joining. So each of our other three panelists will have a bit more time, and that will bring us to about 45 to 15 minutes, and then we'll move on to questions from the audience. So, unless there are no questions, we'll get started. And our first panelist today is Jojo Mehta, who is the co-founder and executive director at Stop Ecocide International. And Stop Ecocide International is the driving force behind and central communication hub for the growing global movement to make ecocide an international crime. Hello, Jojo, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you this evening. And I think I completely share your feeling around what's been happening. And it was pretty sobering seeing that summary yesterday when the IPCC report, the latest working group report came out, and the kinds of language that are being used to describe it, for example, by Ho-Sing Lee, who's the chair of that IPCC chair, saying that, immediate and urgent action is absolutely now imperative, and half measures are no longer an option is actually the phrase that he used. And Deborah Roberts, who's the co-chair of the working group itself, made it clear that tackling all of the challenges that we're facing as a result of climate change involves everyone, involves government, involves the private sector, involves civil society. And there was also the sort of observation that actually things have become more urgent, things have not improved, quite the contrary, since the last assessment report. And we still haven't come to the end of this sixth assessment report. And I think that this, on top of other international reports, is really making clear to the world the sort of stark nature of the crisis that we're in. And it's also, interestingly, making, I mean, it's a strange position for us to be in a sense, because the worse things get out there in the world, the more people pay attention to what we're talking about. And, you know, we very much hope that we sort of can find that point, that sort of almost that acupunctural intervention strategically and legally that can actually, you know, change that balance. And we believe that criminalizing ecocide, particularly at the international level, is a legal tool that has the potential to do that. Because I think as those coming out of, you know, COP26 last year were feeling, you know, this is, and this report reiterates, is that we're all trying to kind of play the same game better. You know, let's reduce emissions a bit more, let's improve things a little bit here or there, you know, tweaking various policies, you know, various regulations and so on. And it's not enough. And if we want to actually play the game in a different way, which is what is actually required here, then it actually involves changing the ground rules, the actual rules of the game. And that is something that we believe Ecocide can do, that criminalizing Ecocide can do. And there have been some key milestones in the growth of this initiative. In particular, last year, the emergence of a legal definition of ecocide. Now, there have been legal definitions, working definitions, if you like, in the past from various quarters, including one from Polly Higgins, who I co-founded this public campaign with back in 2017. But the difference with this legal definition that emerged last year is that it actually was, it emerged in response to political appetite. And that is something that had not been present before. And we were approached by parliamentarians actually from Sweden in 2020, saying, I mean, in their capacity as parliamentarians rather than as the government itself, but saying, you know, we would like to draw on your expertise. You know, can we request that you're able to convene or commission a definition that can be used, a legal definition that can be convened from, you know, lawyers from around the world, that can be used practically to present to governments as a potential fifth crime that they could propose even at the International Criminal Court. So that moves it kind of beyond the sphere of, you know, a lawyer or a group of lawyers simply deciding this should be a law and this is what it should look like. And on the basis of that request and that appetite, that political appetite, we were able to convene a group of 12 lawyers from around the world with differing legal backgrounds, from international criminal law to international environmental law, climate law, humanitarian law, but also different ideologies as well. So from the more conventional participants who were like Charles Jallow, who's a Sierra Leone jurist on the International Law Commission, to former ICC judge Neroni Slade, to at the other end, you could say, Pablo Fajardo, the very activist people's lawyer who championed the case against Chevron in Ecuador. So what we can say is that the definition that emerged, which was a consensus definition, was truly a kind of representation of many different legal backgrounds and many different voices from around the world, and therefore had a huge gravitas to it, and brilliantly chaired by Philippe Sands QC, very well-renowned public international lawyer, and Dior Falso, Senegalese jurist. So I'd like to just introduce briefly this definition so that you can all get a flavour of why this milestone has been so important. And when we launched this definition last year, within a week, well over 100 publications around the world were covering this. It was almost like it sort of somehow suddenly made it real for people, both politicians, but also the media as well, of course, as the legal and academic sectors. So I'm going to share my screen briefly so that I can show you the definition. Hold on just a moment. We're not going to have time to go in great depth, but I would like to give a brief outline here. So the independent expert panel proposed this definition of ecocide as a fifth crime under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in June of last year. And it involves three elements. Firstly, the addition of a paragraph to the preamble of the Rome Statute being the governing document of the International Criminal Court. And it's this simple sentence: concerned that the environment is daily threatened by severe destruction and deterioration, gravely endangering natural and human systems worldwide. So this introduces the focus on the environment into the preamble of the document, which sets the scene for the statute. The addition, of course, of the crime of ecocide itself under Article 5.1, which lists the crimes covered by the statute. Currently, as you probably know, war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. And then we move on to the core of the definition. And as you can see, it's very concise. This first paragraph is really the core of the definition that emerged from that drafting group. For the purpose of this statute, ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. And there follows a paragraph explaining in more detail the terms that are listed in that core paragraph. But I'm just going to focus on 3 points here because we're fairly tight on time. And there are 3 elements that are really important here and that allow for this definition to be kind of both concise and balanced. And I'll explain what those are. So firstly, there are 2 thresholds here. There's one that is about severity of harm. So the likelihood of harm must be severe and either widespread or long-term. And this is aimed as to be an international crime. And so we're looking at harm that must be considerable. Okay, we're not talking about chopping down the trees on your village green. That's not an ecocide. We're talking about the kinds of acts that create serious destruction and damage, either on an international level or in a very widespread or long-term way. But there's a second threshold to this, and this is you can see in the first line here, unlawful or wanton acts. So those acts must be either unlawful or wanton, and that means that the definition can interact with existing laws, because there's a huge body, of course, of environmental law already in existence. But in many cases, it's either unenforced or it's not strong enough. And so putting this term here actually gives, it actually strengthens the body of law that's already in existence, as well as acknowledging that laws vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So this doesn't kind of dive in with an absolute definition saying, if you do X, it will always be unlawful, it will always be a crime. It meshes in with the existing laws. However, with the term wanton, what it also does is provide for where there are situations where an activity may be permitted, but the damage that it causes is disproportionately severe, then it can still fall under this definition. So this allows for a flexibility, but it also allows for a kind of future-proofing of this definition, because what it means is that everyone that's working on improving regulation in any given area, and there's huge expertise and many different organizations involved in, as well as activists on the ground and academics and experts, all working on particular areas of law. And this definition supports all of that, because everything that's improved in a given area will then contribute to how effective this crime will be. And then the third element that I think is also hugely important in the context of international crime is that this is a crime of endangerment. And particularly with international environmental crime, because we don't want to have to wait until half the planet is destroyed before we have to work our way back to see who is at fault. The way that this definition is phrased, it's unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood. So the aim is preemptive, it's preventive. Effectively, this aims to go back to the decision makers at the highest level before they sign on those dotted lines, for example, that might trigger a project or an activity which is likely to cause that severe harm. And that's hugely important. And taken together, these elements create a kind of a framework that I would say is actually, I'm going to stop sharing again here, that is hugely relevant to the situation in which we find ourselves in regard to, for example, the report that came out yesterday. There's a sense of, however, what all the striving that we're doing is somehow not moving us fast enough, and it's not being effective enough. And what we would contend is that that's because the overall framework isn't containing and steering and directing and preempting our activities in the way that is required. And that is something that we believe this law of Ecocide can do. And this definition has been very well received, actually, in political circles, which is really interesting. Frans Timmermans, who's the Vice President of the European Commission, described it as an excellent starting point for states to enter into discussion over this law, and that's hugely encouraging. Also hugely encouraging was the other milestone that we had at the International Criminal Court last year, where 3 sovereign states, some of the most climate vulnerable states in the world, Bangladesh, Samoa, and Vanuatu, co-hosted an event to present this definition to the Assembly of States Parties at the International Criminal Court. In other words, in the context for which it was intended. And most pertinently, of course, to this particular event tonight, Belgium also contributed to that event with an impromptu diplomatic intervention explaining the situation in Belgium, which I'm sure Marie will maybe go into in more detail, but there was a very important vote towards the end of last year mandating, or rather demanding from the parliament that the Belgian government legislate for ecocide and support it at the International Criminal Court. So I think what we can clearly say at this stage is that this initiative to criminalize ecocide at the international level is firmly on the table, courtesy of a growing public movement and grassroots movement, but also courtesy of this development of this definition and its presentation to the International Criminal Court. I'll leave it there for my introduction. I'm very much open to questions later on and further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jojo, for providing us with this overview. I was actually in the chamber in Brussels when this was voted at the end of last year. It was definitely an incredible goosebump-worthy moment. From the question perspective, thank you so much for those who have already asked questions. If you want to ask questions, we'll reply to them at the end once all the panelists have gone. So if you could use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, that would be really great. I'll now give the floor to Marie Tusa, who is a French environmental activist, a jurist in international environmental law, co-founder of the charity Notre Affaire à tous in France, and also an elected MEP in the Greens EFA group in the European Parliament, and the founder of the International Parliamentary Alliance on the Recognition of Ecocide. Hello, Marie. It's great to have you here. Thank you for joining, especially in this context. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Chloe, and hello to everyone. No, I'm really happy to be here, and actually quite sad that Olivier De Schutter couldn't join us, but we know he's a real support in all of our actions for international ecological justice, isn't he? So it's sad, but we're really happy to be here, and it's really important. Kim just told it in the chat. If you haven't seen it, please go in the chat, because you also have ideas for mobilization on the 20th of March, which is quite soon. And we need everyone to get mobilized. So I was asked to talk more on the European side, since Jojo already addressed the international issues. But of course, the EU itself is really important in the matter of recognition of ecocide, because if all EU member states were to support the recognition of ecocide at ICC level, it would be 1/3 of the members of the ICC, which would already be really important, because we could hold European companies responsible for ecocide, which would mean a lot. And we're talking about Russia, for instance. Total, who is not only European but also French, is drilling a lot in Russia and taking a lot of money from it, and especially waiting for the Arctic to not exist anymore to go and look for more oil and gas. So we would be able to prevent it's what Jojo said, right? To prevent Total and others from doing this kind of activities, but it would also greatly help at international level. And that's the first thing, maybe as an introduction, that I want to say is that the IPCC and Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, when they presented the report on the consequences and the impacts of climate change, underlined the fact that the Russian crisis, the Ukrainian crisis today, and climate change have the same systemic causes and systemic consequences, which mean a lot more conflicts, a lot more violence, and a lot of more injustices. And that is all because we rely too much on fossil fuels. So when we are talking about Ecocide, we are indeed talking about the current situation, and we can perfectly see with this example that we really need to put an end to Ecocide, and especially concerning Russia and Ukraine. Well, if we put an end to the extraction of fossil fuels, what we need to preserve the climate, then we would also be able to work towards peace. So this is a very important discussion that we're having today. And even though we're indeed demonstrating and discussing Ukraine in the day in the European Parliament, Ecocide is very much linked to it and really important. So where do we stand right now in the EU? And actually in the world? Well, what we can see is that even understood in a strict sense, which doesn't mean Ecocide, but even understood in a strict sense, environmental crime is exploding, really exploding. From what we see, it's exploding so much that it has now become as lucrative as drug traffic. And Interpol estimates that the destruction of nature linked to environmental crime is worth up to $280 billion a year, which is really huge. So Interpol and Europol are really concerned about environmental crime. This is, of course, a global security issue. And when we look at it, the illegal exploitation of natural resources, such as gold, minerals, diamonds, timber, oil, and wildlife, for instance, among others, are currently the largest source of conflict financing, accounted for an estimated 38% of illicit financial flows to armed groups involved in conflicts. So indeed, we are talking about the same issue, right? Ecocide and peace. It's actually the same issue. And environmental criminality can also be, unfortunately, a source and benefit to terrorist activities. And we had some studies published that show that environmental crime is one of the main sources of financing of some of the terrorist groups. But I'm talking to you about environmental crimes understood, as I said before, in a strict way, not in a narrow way. So when we look at what's happening now, climate change, the extinction of biodiversity, but also the current oil spills in Peru, Thailand, Nigeria, Ecuador, right at the moment, 4 of them. Chernobyl, of course, which we are currently reminded of, but also the exploitation of fishes in European waters or outside, mostly outside of European waters, the use of nitrogen fertilizers, the use of pesticides and even glyphosate are not considered as ecocide and are not even considered as environmental crimes. And this is one of the issues that we have to deal with right now. If we want to protect the living, if we want to protect human life on Earth, and if we want our law to reflect our values, then we really need to change it. And this is what we are fighting for. And of course, ecocide is the most serious of these crimes, and the concept is getting more and more common and priority in EU institutions because of our common hard work and campaigning. And we're all working together for a long time now, and that's together that we managed to get there. So where do we stand? On the European Parliament side, we have asked 6 times for the recognition of ecocide at international level and also in EU law. And that's now that we can change it because we are revising the directive for the protection of the environment through penal law. So now we can get into concrete work. On the European Commission side, as Jojo said, they are saying it's a promising proposal. And even that the panel definition is a promising proposal. But what they say now, and that's why we need so much mobilizations, as Kim was talking about in the chat, is that they say that there is no emergency because the public opinion is not supporting this proposal enough. So we need to mobilize and to move forward. And then on the Council side, well, Jojo talked a bit about the states asking for the recognition of ecocide at international level, so also at EU level. We have Belgium as an acting member state. We have France who is playing with the definition, and I'll get to that later, but we really need to push the Council, the member states, to call for the recognition of ecocide. And we also have a growing mobilization of civil society, which I thank everyone and also Harriet for. So we are right now, as I said, revising the directive, which dates from 2008. What the Commission is proposing is quite ambitious, but it stays in the box, which means that we will enlarge the list of criminal offenses, enlarge the list of laws that define the crime. We will strengthen the provisions on criminal sanctions. It will be able to go up to 10 years of imprisonment, but also big fines on companies, which is really important, the most important, I believe. Also the enforcement chain and the role of citizens and civil society with a specific article on the protection of environmental defenders and other provisions that help to fight against environmental crimes. But what the Commission doesn't do is to recognize that nature has a value in itself and that we need to condemn any damages that is done to the environment and nature. And in particular, they are quoting ecocide in the introduction of the text, but nowhere in the text itself. So that's our work right now in the European Parliament to push for the insertion of the definition of ecocide, but also environmental crimes within this directive, and then to mobilize the Council with the help of civil society in order to get it really in European law. We can do it. We can definitely do it. We're building a strong coalition inside of the European Parliament to be able to defend the recognition of ecocide and environmental crime. We think that we can manage at least to have ecocide recognized by the European Parliament, and then we'll see with the Council, but we can maybe manage something. But for that, we need all the mobilization of the citizens so the mobilization 20th of March, but also the petition that I hope Philippine from my team will send in the chats for you to sign it. And that's a petition that you have to sign and sign the petition of Stop Ecocide for ICC. Just a final word, and I think I'm keeping my time, so I'm really happy about it. Cool, thanks, Chloe. The last thing is that we have a lot of difficulties in front of us, a lot of challenges. First of all, we won't recognize environmental crimes. Maybe we'll talk about it in question and answers, but we won't recognize environmental crimes as such because it's too much of a threat for economic activities, and they can agree to recognize the worst crimes, but they won't recognize the normal crimes, which is one of the difficulties that we have, but we won't stop. And maybe in 5 years, we will manage it. But right now, the biggest risk that we have, and I want to put it in the debate as well, is that the EU behaves just as France did, which means that the EU would agree to insert ecocide in the law, but with a very weak definition, not the one from the panel that Jojo presented us, which would be the ideal definition, but with a weaker definition. And if that's the case, then we will all need together to decide whether this is good to have this ecocide in European law, or if we want to ask for more, for a real ecocide to be recognized, and then keep on working in that direction. I will be happy to dig more into the issue at the end of the presentations.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for reminding us that the devil is indeed in the details, and that sometimes, proposals that can seem very ambitious can actually be quite weak when you look into the fine prints. Our third panelist today is Harriet. So Harriet Mackail, I hope I said it correctly, who is an EU climate governance and human rights policy coordinator at CAN Europe. And CAN stands for Climate Action Network, and it's the Europe's leading NGO coalition fighting climate change, with over 170 member organizations active in 38 European countries, representing over 1,500 NGOs and more than 47 million citizens, can promote sustainable climate, energy, and development policy throughout Europe. Thank you so much for being here, Harriet. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Chloe. I don't think I could have presented Can Europe better than that. I think you got it spot on. So thanks a lot for having me here tonight. It's really a pleasure to be able to be amongst you and to kind of bring civil society's voice to the discussion. And I think Marie and Jojo have put it very, very concretely. I think there's a very necessary need to mobilize around this topic. So I'd like to contextualize Ecocide a little bit around the climate crisis we're living in. And to kick us off, I'd like to borrow the words of Farhana Yamin, an environmental lawyer that has participated in about 30 COPs. And at COP26, she wrote her Manifesto for Justice. And I feel that these words kind of fully capture the state of current affairs. So the atmosphere, oceans, soils, forests don't get to negotiate. Smaller countries and indigenous people are nature's custodians. Mother Earth may be mentioned in the Paris Agreement, but she lacks any legal standing. Now, I feel this kind of brings us to the next kind of element I'd like to talk about that Jojo has already mentioned. Only yesterday, so the IPCC came forward with its most recent report on climate impacts. And I think the messages are extremely clear. And there are a couple I'd like to convey here. One of them being that the impacts of human-made climate change, fueled mainly by the burning of fossil fuels, are rapidly increasing and experienced by people virtually all over the planet and are already extremely severe. I think we can all remember natural disasters over the past couple of years, be it major floods, forest fires, heat waves. And I think it's good to remind ourselves that these will only continue to get worse. In particular, in those countries and population segments least responsible for the emissions causing the climate crisis, which suffer higher vulnerabilities. So just to give you a better picture of the seriousness of this crisis, approximately today, 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in contexts that are highly vulnerable to climate change. The report calls for respect for knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities, in particular in adaptation efforts and recognition of their rights for successful responses, which highlights the need for Ecocide to be recognized and included in as many sectoral pieces of legislation as possible. Compared to previous reports, this one includes clearer calls for inclusive and fair policies to contain the climate crisis, where prioritizing risk reduction, equity, and justice bear far better chances of effective climate resilient development. So with this in mind, I think we can all agree that the need for such protection is undeniable. So 6 years after the Paris Agreement, carbon emissions remain relentless, despite countless government pledges year after year, negotiations, summits, councils. We are still heading for global warming well above the 1.5 recommended. Also, despite the need for the need to safeguard the natural environment to mitigate the worst impacts of global heating, governments have been remarkably reluctant to sign environmental protection into law and rather happy also to continue business as normal. For example, I think a good example is what Marie mentioned, for example, putting Ecocide into the introduction, but not into the text itself. So always kind of half step forwards. So whilst those defending the environment often find the law used against them through the criminalization of peaceful protests, or when their rights are ignored when illegal acts are committed against them by companies and local authorities, it's proven difficult to hold those destroying the environment truly accountable. The rise of the concept of Ecocide is running side by side with the increased success of a growing number of environmental legal cases. I have three that come to mind that I think you're probably all already aware of. For example, when the Dutch court ordered last year the Royal Dutch Shell to cut its carbon emissions faster, or when Germany said it would have to revise its emissions reduction targets after the country's highest court ruled existing climate laws imposed too great a burden on the young, or again in the Agenda case, which forced the Netherlands to come forward with a new package of climate measures. So in that case, why is it that this has never been tried in court before? I think this, the part of the reason for this is that the environment has never had the ability or standing to bring a legal action for harm done to it. So legal accountability usually relies on there being some sort of damage to people or private, to people or private or public property protected by law. Obviously, that becomes more tricky when polluters are contributing to a broader destructive system which causes damage at a global level. So criminalizing ecocide would fill this legal gap and allow individuals to be prosecuted for engaging in acts with knowledge that they are substantially likely to damage the environment without the need to show harm to any individual person. So if adopted, it would put severe environmental ruin on par with war crimes and open a path to putting chief executive and presidents on the stand. It would provide an effective counter to distract and delay tactics employed by the fossil fuel industry to deter politicians from taking the urgent and transformative action we need to avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis. So with the status of an international crime, politicians would no longer be able to frame environmental destruction as a fringe concern which can be deprioritized. And also, I think something that's good to mention here is that even if it doesn't happen or if it takes a long time to happen, campaigners such as myself and all of civil society are banking on the mere legal existence of Ecocide to change the behavior of large corporations. It gives a sign that the planet and the climate crisis are being taken seriously. So the campaign surrounding the efforts matters just as much as the final result. This is maybe a personal opinion, but with legal cases, it's always been the case, matters just as much as the final results. It contributes to bringing people together, empowering people, and changing consciousness. And I think a nice image of this to encourage us and to move forward is how amazing would it be if we were to wake up to Bolsonaro being led into a courtroom in The Hague and him being told that his policies in the Amazon have been so destructive that he is now guilty of a crime of ecocide. Amazing. So I think ecocide could join the legal arsenal alongside due diligence, if it were to be enshrined in the Environmental Crimes Directive, also to hold decision makers and companies accountable. So the litigation cases that I've mentioned previously have been continuously building the link between human rights and the climate crisis. So the climate crisis that we are living is the biggest threat to human rights ever. So one may ask, what human rights are we actually talking about? So we're talking about the most basic you could actually imagine, which is the right to life and the right to a private life. These two articles, Articles 2 and 8 of the ECHR. So with those articles being in a charter, that obviously goes hand in hand with the right to defend those rights when they are violated. So for ecocide to become a crime against humanity and or for ecocide to be included into the Environmental Crimes Directive would allow every single citizen to hold a company or government to account for starting and continuing with the extractions of fossil fuels. So I think we can all agree that the consequences of climate change have major implications for the full enjoyment of the human rights of present, future, and also including unborn generations. Lower income countries, indigenous people, small scale farmers, children, and the poor did not cause the climate countries, however, are already bearing the most adverse consequences. So not only will criminalizing ecocide be part of the solution for saving humanity, but it will give the most vulnerable in society a voice, alongside giving nature a voice too. So I think I'll stop there. Unfortunately, it would have been great to hear from Olivier a little bit more about the due diligence directive that is also being revised. However, maybe Marie and I and myself could answer a couple of questions if ever there were any more to come up on that. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Harriet. That was very interesting. Thanks to those who have asked questions. Keep them coming. We actually have a bit more time because Olivier wasn't able to join, so we'll have time for questions. And before I actually start asking the questions that were asked by the audience, I have one myself. And this one is for Marie, but if Jojo and Harriet, you want to answer, feel free as well. And it's about the kind of political context, because obviously if it were up to civil society or the lawyers, you know, who helped draft a definition of ecocide, ecocide would obviously already be a reality. Yet it's not, and it's not because policymakers are still refusing or still kind of backtracking on this. When I mentioned I was in the Belgian chamber when the resolution on ecocide was adopted, and what happened was that we heard discourse from the Belgian far-right party, notably, who was, obviously displaying a lot of bad faith, let's put it that way, when it came to the definition, but also when it came to the implementation. And so I guess my question is, can ecocide become a reality without the political context, without a progressive political context, meaning political parties, MEPs, policymakers that come from progressive parties that actually do want ecocide to become a reality? Or are we doomed to wait another decade, possibly, if we keep having conservatives in power, in position of power? And this one's for Nori. Do you want me to repeat the question? Yeah, no, it was about the political framework and the fact that if civil society, had its own way, we already would have ecocide. But because the thing is, we have a lot of conservatives currently in power all around Europe, more specifically, we don't have ecocide as a reality. So is it dependent? Is its implementation? Is ecocide becoming a reality dependent on the political context? And if so, what do we need to do? Do we need to wait another 10 years to have more progressive in power who can actually push for the implementation of ecocide?
Thank you, Chloe. I'm sorry, I was looking at, actually due diligence legislation and the last decisions that we have to make on this. And I'd be happy indeed, as Harriet said, to also discuss this issue. Chloe, your question is really broad. But my answer is really short. We have no time to lose. We have no time to lose, and we have to move real fast now. I do believe that we are making a lot of movements in the last years, haven't we? I mean, in 2018, 2019, we saw a huge wave, green wave or whatsoever, but huge climate social movements, most of it being impulsed by Greta Thunberg and the youth, but not only. And we have been able to put ecocide on the agenda, whereas it wasn't before at all. We were a few of us talking about ecocide, working on the definition of ecocide, but we've made huge steps. And what does it show? It shows that if we hold to our mobilization, if we stay determined, and we act in the direction of recognizing ecocide, we can manage it in the coming years. And we have really no time to lose. We did before the climate, for biodiversity and planetary boundaries in general, or for the people that Harriet said are suffering a lot from the destruction of the environment and the policies that are led that destroy both the earth and human beings. So we really need to keep tight. Sorry for my English, not only do I have a French accent, but I also lose my words sometimes. But it's absolutely necessary. And I believe that with the work that we're all doing throughout the world, being all in contact all the time and really determined, and also I have to say really womanly determined, which is good as well, I believe, we can really reach out the recognition of ecocide in the, let's say, 2 to 5 years. So let's do it.
Can I add something in there?
Sure.
Yeah, no, I suppose there's another few encouraging words, which is that, some of the sectors that one might think would be resistant in this arena, I mean, some are really starting to pay attention, and that particularly I think applies to the investment community and to the insurance community. And these are sectors that actually have quite a strong influence on perhaps those more conservative political elements. I mean, I'll just give one example. The International Corporate Governance Network, which is a network of global asset managers, is lots of big asset management firms, financial firms, like, big banks like BlackRock and UBS and Ernst & Young and all these kinds of firms. their network issued a statement at COP26 where they actually called on governments to collaborate on criminalising ecocide, which is hugely encouraging. And we have since discovered that there was sort of two elements to that part of that statement that covered effectively encouraging the mandating of regulation and the collaboration on ecocide. And those two elements, one was about stability and about actually having a framework in place where investors can actually know what is permissible, what is not permissible, and therefore how to manage the risks of what they're putting their money into. So that was one side. But the other side, which very encouragingly, was that many of them are now looking at what is happening in the world and realizing that something serious actually needs to be done. And it was really encouraging to hear that that was one of the factors that had led to that statement. And I think there's a kind of encouraging symptom there that it's not only the progressives and the activists that are working on this. It's actually those who are in the corporate and financial sector are really starting to take notice. And I think it's also very important to realize that the time between now and when the law is actually adopted is super important, because the important thing is for all of those actors to see this coming. And that's where the public campaign comes in really importantly, because the bigger that this conversation is, and the more inevitable it becomes effectively. And we're already hearing from even quite conservative political directions that they know this is coming. They just don't know when. And so, we see ourselves as accelerating something that is actually inevitable. And having that inevitability on the horizon is what can influence policy and corporate decision-making now, and their strategy as to how they're going to effectively treat that as a compliance period, if you like, between now and when the law comes into place. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm now going to go into the questions from the audience. And the first one is very straightforward, is can ecocide legislation, regulation, I'm guessing the person meant be included in World Trade regulation, for that is a strong actor preventing global action. I don't know who wants to take this one. Link between ecocide and World Trade regulation. Harriet, you unmuted.
Yeah, but I just didn't turn off my mic, but I can try to do it. But I believe Harriet and Jojo can answer that as well. I don't see exactly what you mean, the person who raises the question. I saw the question before. But what we know is that right now trade is being done in a way that is killing the planet, the living, and also increasing injustices and inequalities. So we need to change that. And of course, if we recognize ecocide, then maybe, for instance, the use of pesticides that are forbidden in the EU because they are too dangerous, the use of pesticide abroad would be also forbidden. So the trade of pesticides would be forbidden. When I talked a bit before, I also talked about the fishes. And we know that we are currently authorizing a lot of companies, among which EU companies, to take fishes, huge stock of fishes, to transform them into fish food for EU fishes. I don't know if you followed me, because that's a bit crazy, so it's hard to understand, but that's also ecocide. So there it would have, of course, an impact on trade. We are also working on forests and the protection of forests in the world, and the EU is one of the main importers of products issued from deforestation abroad, up to 16%. And of course, it's about trade. It's about soya, cocoa, and other, and we're working both on the due diligence, general due diligence, and on deforestation due diligence right now. And well, by recognizing ecocide, we would also allow to prevent too big damages to be caused, and products to be imported. And I could go on and on and on about the impacts that would have the recognition of ecocide on global trade. But of course, what you need to understand is that trade is being unfair and destructive right now, most of the time, not always, unfortunately. But of course, recognition of ecocide would change all this trade that is currently bad and that we cannot control enough at the moment.
Thanks, Marie. We have a few questions on fossil fuel, and the link between ecocide and fossil fuel. So I'm directing them at you, Harriet, but of course, Marie and Jojo, if you want to jump in, you're more than welcome to. The first one is, can ecocide legislation be a springboard for divestment from fossil fuel?
I think if I wanted to keep the answer really short, would be yes. A massive one. I'll elaborate a little bit though. I think the way that we could use ecocide is that I think it would change, well, we would hope it would change companies and the way companies and politicians think. If they think that by continuing to extract these fossil fuels, they will be at risk, there'd be too much, the feasibility of the project would not be okay in terms of the profits, because they all function on profits, then we hope they would move back from it. I think what ecocide would also manage to do is accountability. So for projects that are already ongoing, and for those that would be to happen, is to hold them accountable. So I think it's a very good tool to add to our toolbox from a policy perspective to actually manage to come away from fossil fuel exploration. I think, yeah, I'll let Jojo or Mary contribute to that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Harriet, and I also think that the important aspect here is the criminal law side of ecocide, because I think, you know, the body of environmental law that we have in the world is relatively young. It's sort of 3 to 4 decades that environmental law has been developing, and most of it, not all of it, most of it is in the regulatory sphere. So effectively is civil law. And when we improve or change regulation, what we tend to see is that corporations adjust their budgeting, whereas when a criminal law aspect is introduced, we can start to see changes in behavior. And I think that actually speaks to the previous question as well, because it's a very different consideration to have your personal freedom on the line, and rather than just being able to sort of hide behind the sort of corporate veil, if you like, and for there to be fines or I mean, the worst case scenario, a company might get shut down, but those people who have ultimately made those decisions, you know, are not affected. Whereas with criminal law, and particularly at the ICC, it's focused specifically on individual responsibility at the highest level, and that has a way of, as Philippe Sands puts it, concentrating the mind, that has a really strong effect, and would do so, we believe, also in the cases of, for example, you know, approval of a new extraction project, for example. So yes, I think there are some very concrete influences that ecocide could have in that context.
And staying with fossil fuel, but more who could be targeted, there was another question. Is there a differentiation for how ecocide could be used to charge fossil fuel lobbyists as opposed to the fossil fuel companies they represent, or the politicians that act on such lobbying, or is it all the same baskets? So I guess who could be the target, quote unquote?
I think that, yeah, no, you could go ahead, Mary.
No, I was about to say Jojo can begin. We're too courteous. Maybe really quick, I believe that we have a hard political battle to lead with lobbyists, and especially when we see that fossil fuel lobbyists are so into every single institution and even the COPs. There we have a problem. However, being a lobbyist in itself is not committing a crime. Well, depends on how you do it, right? But it's not putting a damage on the environment. Regarding politicians, however, there we can have a personal responsibility that would be recognized in front of the courts and the police. And this is, of course, one of the main breaks to the recognition of ecocide. When we think, for instance, about Jair Bolsonaro and the harm is done to Brazil, especially to the Amazonia, there we can really think about the recognition of ecocide. But there it raises a lot of issues, geopolitical and diplomatic issues, of course, but also other kind of issues, like how do we stop him? So these are a lot of issues still to be discussed, but definitely being a politician would take bad decisions that endanger the safety of the living and of human beings on this planet would be held responsible for ecocide.
Thank you both. Then I have something, it's a bit specific, but how do we reimagine corporate law to remove dangerous limited liability? And that person gave the example of how Iceland jailed bankers compared to how other countries allow them to hide behind the notion of limited liability.
For me, this comes down again to the individual criminal responsibility, where effectively it's a natural person, not a corporate entity, that can be held responsible under criminal law with ecocide. And I think that's actually one of the most important aspects of it in terms of its deterrent potential. Exactly how I would link that into the Iceland situation, I'm not sure off the top of my head, but it feels like that's the core of that issue.
Maybe I could add something here, just briefly. I think that's maybe somewhere where the new due diligence might come in, although that is obviously company responsibility. But there are directors' duties under that. Under the Iron Article 24, I believe, under the directive. And there are different elements that are linked to civil liability and some that are not. And for example, one thing that needs to be bettered in that regulation, or that is for the moment, directive, that is for the moment still unclear, is, for example, to do with climate due diligence. So the way it is done right now, it is not absolutely sure. It is put under directors' duties, but it is not linked directly to civil liability. So I think that's something that also needs to be tweaked in that directive, for example, and could also play hand in hand with the notion of ecocide and individual responsibility that Jojo was just talking about.
There's a question specifically, I think, on the definition. It's how would you compare and contrast environmental crimes with ecocides? So maybe a bit more specifics on how they relate to each other, but it's still different.
Maybe I can do it. Okay. So ecocide, I believe Jojo explained it so well that I don't have to come back on this. But basically, it's the major environmental crimes. Then we have environmental crimes that are damages caused to nature and that are not recognized. So right now, what we have is that the judiciary, to recognize an environmental crime, you need to have violated an existing law. So for instance, if you hunt in a Natura 2000 site, it can be, it's not always, but it can be that you are committing an environmental crime. But if you hunt too much outside of a Natura 2000 site, then it wouldn't be recognized as an environmental crime. I will give another example that might be more speaking to you. You might have learned about chlordecone, which is a very dangerous pesticide forbidden in the United States, recognized as a cancerogen by all global health institutions. But still that was spread in French Antilles for years because it was authorized by French authorities. Well, there you have an environmental crime and even an ecocide, which is not and cannot be considered as such because it was authorized by France, by the French authorities. And then you cannot recognize that as an environmental crime. So autonomous environmental crimes would be to recognize the fact that any act that causes a damage to nature and or to human living, human health, for instance, must be considered as a crime. And this is not the case right now. Well, the example I gave about chlordecone is actually an ecocide, but you can imagine damages caused to a lesser extent that we, I believe here in this conference, consider as an environmental crime, but wouldn't be recognized. And I believe that, for instance, the use of glyphosate, that we all know is very dangerous, that is still authorized in the EU right now. Well, we can consider that as an environmental crime. However, as long as this is not explicitly forbidden by the EU, then we can not go and look for a penal responsibility when it goes to the damages that it caused. And this is a real issue that we need to deal with.
Thank you, Marie. I have a question then about countries not parties of the Rome Statute. So what to expect from countries like China, the US, and India, which are not parties of the Rome Statute, in terms of a potential lobby against a possible amendment of the status, and later of the incorporation of the amendment to domestic legal orders and the effectiveness of the measure, considering these countries are the main polluters right now.
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. There's a few points to raise in this regard. It's true that some of the big polluting countries are not members of the ICC. Obviously, there's one rather obvious advantage to the Ecocide initiative in that they don't have a vote. So effectively, when it comes to moving it forward at the ICC, they don't have an official say in that. Which may be an advantage. But there are also other ways that those countries can be affected by an international crime of ecocide. There are already some methods of applying international criminal law even to non-member states. I mean, that can happen if, at one end, it can happen if the UN Security Council, files a communication, but it can also happen. I mean, for example, there's the situation in the Ukraine at the moment, where although the Ukraine isn't a member, in 2013 and 14, I believe, gave a sort of its official authority that the jurisdiction of the ICC could cover that territory. So that's also a situation that can arise. The other thing is that if a crime is being committed on by a non-member, but on the territory of a member state, then that's also prosecutable. And it's even under the principles of universal jurisdiction, it can even be in a third party state. So, for example, Belgium, which, as we know, is a front runner in this conversation globally, has historically used universal jurisdiction, or universal competence as it's sometimes known. And under those principles, a perpetrator of a crime that was serious enough could be arrested on Belgian territory, regardless of whether they were from Belgium or whether the actual effect was being felt in Belgium. So that's just to give you an example. So there are a number of ways that such a law could practically reach non-member states. But then there's also the issue of the kind of moral entrainment that happens when if an international crime is designated at the International Criminal Court, although it may not directly be sort of valid in those particular jurisdictions, as there is an accumulation of ratifications from other countries in the world, and of course, given the incredibly international nature of trade and politics, it becomes a kind of impetus in a certain direction. So if you like, it puts the writing on the wall even for those countries. So yes, it's not a perfect solution, obviously, in the sense that only 123 member states are 123 states are members of the International Criminal Court, but that nonetheless creates a very strong impetus in the right direction, we hope. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jojo. There's a question about a very concrete example on what Ecocide can do to help a concrete situation that is currently unfolding. So Canada continues to insist that we need new pipeline capacity to move bitumen from the Alberta tar sands against strong opposition from citizens and particularly from indigenous communities whose unceded lands and waters are threatened by extractive industries. And this despite the fact that Canada last year passed a law to implement UNDRIP. I don't know what this stands for. No, I'm not sure. Anyway, I'm guessing something related to environmental crimes, probably. How might an ecocide law be used in addressing the hypocritical posture of the Canadian government and further Indigenous land rights? So how could ecocide help with this very concrete situation, for instance, if ecocide was a reality?
Okay, I mean, I'm happy to kind of try and tackle that one. I mean, I think it's actually quite difficult to look at very specific instances at this stage because that, if, for example, the definition text that I explained earlier is likely to be perhaps a starting point for discussion between states and may or may not end up being the eventual text that's adopted. And what I've noticed is that the international criminal lawyers in particular tend to avoid giving very specific examples of how something would play out in a given situation, because of course, you know, the evidence and the facts of the case are what will then be put in front of the judges, and that will be assessed. So it's a bit difficult to sort of preempt exactly. What we can say is that, I mean, Canada is part of this conversation in the sense that they have said that they are watching developments closely, but for all the reasons that question enumerates, Canada's a bit of a fence sitter on this one. You know, they like to be seen as the as a sort of leader in the environmental arena, but it's a little tricky to maintain that position when you've got the tar sands in your jurisdiction. So so there's definitely a kind of, there's an ambiguity and ambivalence, if you like, in the Canadian position. But there's no doubt that, you know, were Canada to ratify this law, there would be some serious considerations for them to make in this context. And I suppose the serious question that arises is, you know, well, we would guess that Canada would not be a first country to run to adopt this law, given that context. But again, I would say that what we're looking at there is the importance of public pressure and of the cumulative adoption by other states. But yes, I mean, certainly, as Canada would, if Canada signed up to this, yes, it would have a very direct bearing on that situation.
If I may add something, not related to Canada, I think Jojo answered that, but on the rights of Indigenous peoples in general, recognizing ecocide would, of course, help sanctioning, but also preventing, and I believe this part is the most important, preventing huge damages caused to the ecosystems, which are really often the place where the Indigenous peoples live. So it would be really important. And that's also one of the reasons why there is currently suspended by Bolsonaro's majority, of course, but a proposal for the recognition of ecocide coming from Brazil. So we hope that Bolsonaro is going to get away soon, and that we will be able to get Brazil on board. And of course, it would help the protection of the rights of Indigenous peoples. But what I also do believe, and I want to underline that and stress it out, is that by recognizing ecocide, we also strengthen the rights of the people to at least alarm, and maybe to the biggest extent even reach out to justice directly to defend nature. And this is also a real improvement that we would have with the recognition of ecocide, is to strengthen the right to access to justice on environmental matters all throughout the world. And this is something, of course, that we really need. And I believe it's worth adding here.
I think there's also an issue of framing here, in the sense that at the moment, those who are defending the environment, environmental defenders, are often cast as the criminals, you know, because they're interrupting lawful activity. Whereas once you have a different framing in place, effectively those environmental defenders become the sort of moral upholders of the law. So you've got a real kind of flip that narrative that has the potential to happen, and would very much support the Indigenous land defenders.
Then we have an interesting question. Is it difficult to assess at what point negligence is judged to be criminal? For example, would one consider that the Fukushima nuclear plant operator was criminally negligent for ignoring the risk of a tsunami? What point does negligence become criminal?
Okay, I can answer that at least a bit, and then Jojo and Harriet can jump in and add to what I want to say. But two things. First of all, we know that nuclear plants are dangerous. We know that some of them are more dangerous than others. And we perfectly knew that with building a nuclear power plant right next to the sea in a country where we have a lot of typhoons and everything, is dangerous. And I believe nuclear plants in general are way too dangerous for the humans to accept. So there is no negligence included here. We know that this is dangerous and that it will destroy a lot of humans and non-humans beings. So that's for the first point about Chernobyl or Fukushima. I don't remember, both of them. And second thing, we've been recognizing negligence as a cause in penal law for years, throughout the EU and in many countries. So of course we have to be careful in the way that we use it, but it's becoming more and more used, and especially regarding company penal law. But I want to stress out something, is that when you hurt someone or when you kill someone, a human person, you always have a penal responsibility lying there. And well, sometimes, of course, it's for negligence, when you have a car accident, for instance, or other kinds of causes of death, a building that is destroyed or something. And we don't question the fact that there is a negligence, difficulty to link the cause and the consequence and everything. We only do that when it regards nature. And this is something in our philosophy that we need to change. When it comes to killing or hurting human beings, then we have less precautions right now in our law. And we must finally recognize the value of nature in itself. And don't put too many precautions, too many breaks, too many screens between the act that caused the damage and the damage as we do right now.
I have a question on the inclusion of the voices of the most affected by climate breakdown in the environmental crisis. So would it be positive and powerful step forward to take the voices from the field, the voices of people that are the most affected by climate breakdown and environmental devastation, to the main stages of decision making? So how do we apply a bottom-up approach when it comes to the recognition of ecocide? How do we make sure the frontline voices are centered?
So this is a really, this sort of touches on the sheer breadth, I think, of what we're working with this initiative, because, I mean, it is interesting actually, when Polly Higgins and I co-founded this campaign back in 2017, what we thought we were doing at the time was, in a sense, sort of crowdfunding for diplomatic work. So there was at the time, Ecocide was still considered quite an extreme solution. It wasn't as accepted in the sort of media discussion and political discussion as it is now. And we know some of the reasons for that. But it was also very difficult to get funding for the work that was already underway in terms of the connecting that was already being done with the climate vulnerable island states and so on. But what Polly did have was a big global following. And so the public campaign was originally sort of started as a sort of two-part thing. One was to crowdfund for the diplomatic work, and the other was to support activists, by the nature of the way the campaign was set up. Now, actually, over time, what we realized was that the two things were much more deeply connected. than we'd originally thought. And we can see that because where the frontline conversations are happening and where the sort of noise around this concept is happening, and a lot of that is happening at the grassroots level, that's also where the conversation starts to move at the political level, because that conversation is then live. And France is a very obvious sort of example of this happening, because the French government addressing Ecocide came as a direct result of the Citizens' Climate Assembly that was actually called by the French government in order to come up with grassroots policy suggestions. So I think that that sort of frontline grassroots aspect is a really, really important one, and actually directly interlinks with the progress at the top level as well. So I mean, I think but I mean, it's also an interesting issue for us, because obviously we're communicating with the whole range of audiences, and as a kind of organization often have to remain neutral in some way, but at the same time we really like to showcase cases of frontline voices. You know, we have a guest blog which we really invite anyone on this audience to, you know, submit submit blogs to, so that we can, you know, effectively also, you know, showcase those voices, because it's so important to support everybody that's working, you know, against these awful destructive activities on the ground.
Sorry, Mary, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add that, well, we are right now, well, moving towards the recognition of ecocide. So what we're discussing is how do we reach out to politicians, states, representatives from parliament. But actually the request for the recognition of ecocide comes from the frontline defenders. And the word ecocide in itself was firstly used to denounce the ecocide that was happening with the dioxin, the Agent Orange, in Vietnam during the US-Vietnam War. But we were actually, well, not we, but social movements from South America were calling for the recognition of biocide for a longer time. And this is all about the same thing, calling for the recognition of international environmental crimes, because we see that big companies especially are coming in your territory, violating your rights to housing, your rights to water, your rights to health, or even to life, and also destroying the environment, or through the destruction of your environment. So ecocide is actually, when you go back to the roots of it, at the very heart of the mobilizations of frontline defenders.
Just a side note to say, UNDRIP stands for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Someone kindly explained that in the chat. I have one more question that is specifically linked to a specific context / industry, and then we'll move on to a few more that are more about what's next, what can people do to mobilize around ecocide. So if that's okay with you, I'll just ask to keep your answers quite brief so that we can stay in the time frame that we have. This one is, how will this apply to businesses that are shipping secondhand clothing to Africa? Not only do these businesses sell clothing that have been donated, but they're selling damaged clothing and also sending winter clothing to tropical climates, which end up not being used and end up in landfills that are destroying our environment. How would ecocide help curb that? A link with the fashion industry, that obviously is a very problematic one. I don't know who would be interested in answering this. How could ecocide help address, I guess, not only the issue of clothes being sent, but also more broadly, maybe the many issues with the fashion industry?
Yeah, because fashion is about, well, this well-described clothes waste that is sent away. It's also about plastics, because when we talk about the pollution for plastics, which is also an ecocide, we also talk about the plastics that is included in the clothes, and all other chemicals, with a lot of also just and unjust policies that are led. And we also see a lot of shipping of waste. even outside of the closed area, right? And plastic waste, but also nuclear waste and everything that is shipped out to what we call developing countries. And we don't really care about it. And it's good that some countries are rebelling against it and sending back the boats to Western countries to say, okay, take your waste back, right? So this is good. The recognition of Ecocide, and I think, Chloe, that I will end up on this and calling again for the recognition, for the mobilization on 20th of March, which is again in the chat. So thanks a lot also to Louise. And I want to thank also Philippine and Roxanne from my team who are doing an amazing job. But to get back to the question, and the recognition of Ecocide would, of course, be one of the tools to counter this industry of fast fashion. It wouldn't be useful in all the times, because this is one of the issues that we have, is that you have a lot of polluters. It's a bit the same as with fossil fuels. However, fossil fuels, we know that only a few companies are are responsible for most of the emissions. Well, with clothes, it's even more complicated. You have way too many responsibles for that, but it will help though, because we would establish this penal responsibility for, I would say, maybe huge amounts or grave amounts. And we go back to the definition of ecocide that Jojo was presenting at the beginning, right? It needs to be whether very important or long-term or really spread in space and amounts. But we would have a new tool to fight against this kind of behavior. And just to end up with this, the recognition of ecocide is absolutely essential, is central, but not because it would solve everything by itself, but because we are putting as boussole, how do you say boussole? We are giving it, tell me? Compass, a new compass. We are giving a new compass to humanity and human policies. By recognizing ecocide, we say that it's no more acceptable to violate the Earth's rights and human rights. We say that we no longer want for environmental criminals to be not responsible in front of the law and in front of justice. We say that we want everything to change. We say that we want this new compass, and this is as much important as the recognition of ecocide itself, is that with this proposal, this precise proposal, we are really changing the entire philosophy of the way the global system functions right now, and that's why we need so much to work in that direction.
Thanks, Marie. Second to last question. Now that the concept of valuing ecosystem services is becoming more widely accepted, do you think punitive damages might be imposed once ecocide is recognized as a crime based on the loss of those services? Very technical, but the link between ecosystem services and ecocide.
I think it would. The two would definitely be complementary. I think there's a really interesting sort of nexus there between rights of nature, valuing of nature in terms of ecosystem services. And they should, obviously, if you're going to value ecosystem services, it must be the services of the ecosystems preserved and protected in perpetuity. It cannot be, as is often the case with the carbon offset markets, it cannot be just about going and planting trees, which can sometimes even lead to forests being cut down in order for trees to be planted. I mean, it's just, that whole, area is a complete minefield. But so if you're going to value ecosystem services, it must be in the context of protecting ecosystems and communities in perpetuity. At the same time, that if that is accurately valued in a way that the market can understand, you may even have a kind of a wedge for governments to have an incentive to grant rights to nature, because of course if your national treasures are damaged by somebody, then of course you, as this question says, you would have the potential possibility to sue to a huge extent, and that could also be a thread in all of this. And of course then ecocide as a parameter within which those companies should then be taking their decisions, you potentially have quite an interesting kind of correlation between all of those things, but it has to be handled pretty carefully.
Thanks, Jojo. The last question, and it's actually two questions that I'm going to put together. It's kind of about the next step / argument is, what are the key legislative counter-arguments to recognizing ecocide have you encountered since first fighting for ecocide? And vice versa, on the positive side of things, is there a list anywhere of successful relevant steps already taken that can be used to persuade reluctant politicians / businesses or people to get on board? So any success stories, positive arguments versus negative counter arguments that you have heard or that are available somewhere?
Definitely respond to that, but I hope the others will also say what they've experienced. I mean, in terms of the obstacles, it's really interesting. We get asked this quite a lot, but the reality is that it's quite difficult to argue in public that this is a bad idea. It doesn't make you look that good. So most of the opposition is not direct opposition. It will be around things like, oh, this isn't the right time, or, oh, we think we need to tweak something else rather than use this law. But very few people will actually come out directly opposed. And that particularly goes for, say, the fossil fuel companies. And if you spent 30 years greenwashing and trying to, look like you're doing something ecologically acceptable, then to suddenly say you don't think that ecocide should be a crime is not going to go down too well. So the obstacles tend to be behind closed doors. They're going to be with the lobbyists. They're going to be with those bilateral meetings that are being held between, reluctant states, or, and on all of that kind of thing. But in terms of the successes, those are rather more public. I mean, you can go to our website at stopecocide.earth, go and have a look at leading states, go and have a look at breaking news, and you'll see some of the amazing progress. And I'm sure that's also going to be true if you go to, Marie's site too. So anyway, I'll leave it to the others to say their experience.
I'll just maybe say a couple of words. I think from a climate policy perspective, I think the main barrier is to get policymakers in NGOs understand the link that there is between ecocide and climate ambition. So if we were to accept ecocide, what effect that will have on the climate goal that we are all working toward, which is to curb emissions. And that isn't always clear. I feel that when I've been talking about it, people often feel like it's a geeky legal topic that will only be fought in courts, etc., etc. So I think if you are speaking to people or policymakers and NGOs, the best way forward is to explain that link that I think to lots of us here is very obvious. And for me, it was very obvious. So I was a bit shocked when that was the first barrier that I encountered. But I think, yeah, if you can get that one sorted, you can get a lot more climate ambition policymakers and NGOs on board. So yeah, that's my experience.
Marie, do you want to say also something on this, or?
No, because I said I would stop talking, and I usually keep up to my word. But okay, let's create these good stories together.
Indeed, absolutely. 2 minutes past our deadline, so I wanted to thank all the panelists. I wanted to thank all the great questions. If your question wasn't asked, I'm very sorry. It's not that it wasn't a good question, not at all. It's just a matter of time. And there's a few things that are happening and you can get involved in, as you may have seen in the chat. So there's several petitions that you can sign. There's one on Mary's website, there's one on Stop Ecocide's website, there's the mailing list from Stop Ecocide as well. And then there's also a link, if you scroll a little bit up, and it might actually be reshared here, there's a Telegram channel that has been created for people to stay up to date with the global mobilization to recognize ecocide that will take place from March 20th to March 25th. There will be quite a lot of things in Belgium, but there will also be things around the world. So if you want to get involved, feel free to get in touch either on that Telegram channel or with one of the organizing organizations that organized the webinar today. And yeah, let's just all get together and mobilize as much as possible, because as was said by the panelists, we need to show policymakers that there is public support behind ecocide, and that this is something that the people want, and it's not just a geeky legal topic discussion. This is actually something that is needed if we want to achieve the change that we need to achieve in the next few months and years. So thank you so much, everyone. It's been really I started this feeling, as I was saying, a little bit hopeless and helpless, and I'm feeling way more positive now. So I hope this was useful to the audience as well. And I wish you all a lovely evening, if it's evening for you, or a lovely day if you're somewhere else on this beautiful planet. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks a lot, Clary. Thanks, everyone.